So, welcome everyone. Good to see you all here. As you know, we are running these series of Sunday afternoon classes, and I'm very pleased to say that we've had incredible support from the teachers, past and present, who have come to the World Yoga Festival and supported us. And they continue to support us today with these classes. They receive nothing from these classes, just our gratitude, which apparently seems to be sufficient. We put them on because we think that it's necessary to carry on distributing that knowledge to as wide an audience. And thank you, therefore, for giving up your Sunday afternoons and coming in to hear. We continue as a charity, so any donations you make to us then will be most welcome. Today we have Satish Sharma. Now, Satish ji, I met a few years ago. I have to say we're embarrassed because right in our first year at the festival, we really didn't know him and how incredibly important he was. And we were so up to our eyeballs in festivals that we didn't pay much attention, but we made that up from the second year onwards. He's in fact the General Secretary of the National Council of Hindu Temples. So all the Hindu temples that you see dotted around everywhere, he's their General Secretary, which means that he gets to do bulk of the work, to try and get them connected, get his own speakers there, make sure that they're represented. For instance, he does a huge amount of work with Parliament, getting this awareness across. And he's a spokesman on newspapers and articles and radio on many, many occasions. A frequent speaker at such events, and he's extremely knowledgeable. He's the chair of the British Board of Hindu Scholars, so he's a scholar in his own right. And I once saw him do some breathing techniques which left me breathless, I must admit. But so he's a practicing yoga teacher himself. So wonderful person. We're really pleased to have met him. Incredibly knowledgeable. You can read up all about him afterwards. But I'd like to introduce you to him and thank him for coming in and talking to us today. So it's over to you, Satish ji. Is that as much of an introduction as I'm going to give you? You can tell us everything else and whether you want to take questions afterwards and things like that, and fully explain the topic that you'd like to cover today.
Om Ji Ram Ji, and Pranam, and thank you so much for that overly generous introduction. I'm speaking on the subject of Satya, and I'm just thinking back that most of what you have said from one perspective is all mithya, isn't it? So thank you for such a glorious presentation of mithya to introduce myself to the group. So before we start, if you don't mind, I would just like to thank Sonali and Ramji for the incredible seva that they do. I think the first time we met was at Tri Yoga, and yes. I saw the two of you walk into a classroom of over 100 yoga teachers, of which yourselves plus one other person were of non-white origin. And the class was an extraordinary class, and I think I hadn't realized who you were, so I was quite unbridled in my desire to play with that audience. And I could look at you and on occasion see you smiling, thinking, oh my God, this guy's going to embarrass us. 5,000 years of establishing a reputation of gentle scholarliness, and he's really laying into this particular group and leading them on a merry dance. But despite all of that, you were very kind and generous, and have we've worked together in many places now, and I'm very, very grateful to you. Before I go in, I'd just like to add one other thing, and that is that this morning I received news of the passing of a guru brother, almost a gentleman who influenced me greatly, and he was one of the heads of Juna Akhada, which is one of the Naga Baba's traditions in India. And he was such a classically trained, authentic teacher that just being in his presence and hearing him speak for a few moments you would suddenly enter into that boyish innocence that a genuine practitioner seems to be able to refine and cultivate. Well, he passed away last night, and so today my thoughts have been flooded really with memories of the incredible service that he did for so many years. And if on occasion you feel or see me wandering or even rambling, please just forgive it for the time being, and just note that it's just myself recalling something that he may have said or that we may have connected with. So before we jump in, on that note, may I ask everyone just to turn their attention to their gurus and people who have given us some sort of guidance, some sort of support, some sort of light, and just for a moment, acknowledge their contribution and their seva, and let's just treat them and hold them in high regard before we jump into this most elusive of subjects. So, Om Gurur Brahma, Gurur Vishnu, Gurur Devo Maheshwara, Gurur Sakshat Param Brahma, Tasmai Shri Gurubhe Namaha. Om Gurubhyo Namaha, Om Gurubhyo Namaha, Om Gurubhyo Namaha. Om Tat Sat. So, thank you all for turning up on this incredible day. The subject that we're going to talk about today, the truth about Satya, is deliberately, the title is deliberately architected to be mischievous and to be troubling, to be entrancing, to be intriguing. And that is really at the heart of what Mithya does. And knowing Mithya helps us to know what Satya is. Before we jump into this, there are a couple of caveats I'd like to share with you. And I'd like to do a little bit of an introduction in the same way that an air hostess delivers as you board a plane. She warns you about where the exit doors are and certain safety procedures. So I'm going to share those with you before I jump in. Firstly, this conversation only really ever works between two persons who know each other fairly intimately. It's a dance. The way I think of it, it's almost a dance of ghosts. One person is less ghostly than the other, but the dance is a dance of illusions, and there is a great deal of scope for treading on each other's ghostly toes. So this is a conversation, one, which is normally conducted between people who know each other. Secondly, they're consenting adults. This is a very, very adult conversation. It's a conversation which often triggers many deeply held sanskars because that's what it's intended to do. It's intended to plunge us into scrutiny of things that are perhaps not true, but we hold dear. And so my first warning is, as consenting adults, we all know that we have the opportunity at any point to say, I don't believe that. Feel free to reject anything that I say to you. Happily, I'm not really too concerned whether you believe it or not. So equally, I share that freedom with yourselves. If there is something that I say and it doesn't resonate with you, feel free to reject it. Secondly, as consenting adults, we acknowledge that differences are to be applauded, even differences which on occasion cause us to reflect for a moment and feel concern about. We are adult enough to recognize that the diversity of this world and the diversity of its opinions add to the churn. Without darkness, we don't perceive light, etc. Without differences of opinions, we don't experience in the churn, and we don't get the opportunity to transcend that the poison, which is often floated when churning occurs, we don't get the opportunity to transcend it and take hold of the nectar which then follows. So this is a very, very mature and adult conversation. Ramji, have we still got the same number or have half of them left? Good. Well, I'll leave it to you to corral the troops and make sure that even under lockdown we can hold on to this captive.
They're still here. We've got them chained to their respective chairs and tables, so don't worry. They're all here. We're in background, Christina and I, in case anything turns up.
Very good. Lovely. So please, as I said, feel free to reject anything if it's unduly confrontational or unduly, shall we say, troubling. So this conversation that we're going to have is of no value to anybody unless it manages to sink into the sanskar level of who we are. If all I manage to do is share a few words with you, which float around in the space of ideas and memory and intellectual recording of words, then there is a chance that it may not serve you. But my hope is that in the exchange, some of the ideas will sink below that level. And once they start to touch the sanskar layer, that's when we start to have a glimpse and a shift in understanding of who we are and what we are. So please do realize that when sanskar are being troubled and being shifted, that's when we have to step back and, like Shiva, just hold the poison and continue introspecting. Great. My last preparatory piece of equipment is to understand that we're using the medium of words, and specifically that we're using the English language to have this exchange. Now, the English language is a young adolescent language, and it's a language which is still maturing, both in terms of numbers of words, the actual vocabulary, the number of words to describe a particular phenomenon is actually quite small. And there are many, many words which we have in the Sanskrit language, which is an old grandfather language by comparison. Vocabulary has been created for thousands of years. And so there are many ideas which really can only safely be navigated if there are lots of words with which to conceptualize and to compare and to create analogies. If those words don't exist, then we have to create them. And we're in the early stages of doing that. So the first caveat is that we'll be using a language, and I will be doing my best to put into the vocabulary some of the ideas which we've fleshed out a little bit more with words in our own tradition. I'll be using analogies, and as deeply committed yoga practitioners who are engaging in swadhyaya, self-scrutiny and self-study, we're aware that every word has behind it a web of ideas, feelings, memories, and experiences. And every time a word is articulated, a ripple goes through that web and it appears in our understanding. And so we then have an understanding of what that word is. Now, each and every one of us has a different web behind each of these words. So my reference to the dance that is going to be conducted was that with two partners who have worked together on the dance, their mind web is a little similar. It's made to be overlapping. And so then in that dance, one idea can immediately transfer to the other person with an overlap of the mind webs, and so deep understanding occurs. We haven't done that. I know Ramji and Sonaliji and many of the incredible Atmas who come and grace the yoga festival. I see them so skillfully architecting mind webs all the time to create deeper understanding. And so there may be some gaps, but those gaps will, in the journey of time, hopefully start to become smaller and eventually disappear, so that we can have genuine, complete communication of understanding. And then we can really go and work on the sanskars. We are graced today with Swami Ambikanand Saraswati ji, who I can see in the corner of my screen, and she is a master of language. And she has the capacity to articulate something with such skill. And so, Swamiji, if I do say something which is inadequately communicative, please feel free to contribute in the chat or communicate to Ramji, and make sure that we don't miss the opportunity and direct somebody in the wrong direction. Right, so are we almost done with my time now? I just engaged in the preamble, but let's jump in. So first, we have this notion of Satya. Those of us who are yoga practitioners will have come across the yamas and the niyamas, and Satya is often translated as truthfulness. Now, in my own tradition, we have the advantage of our ancients having so deceptively and scurrilously injected into our daily and weekly cultural existence so many little ideas that when we turn to a word like Satya, we see it as something a little bit more than truthfulness. And so I'm going to try and expand on the experience of Satya as we experience it in my tradition. And truthfulness is like a road sign. It says it's something over there, And in that manner, we can start the journey. So Satya, I was scratching my head. There was a time when I could say I was running my fingers through my hair, but my association with the Hindu temples has really put that into the past, and so I can't do that. But I was scratching my head this morning as to how do I put into English, what's the best simple word that I could inject into this conversation, which would have most of what Satya contains. And I think reality is probably the best place to start. So we start with the word reality. Satya is a pointer. Satya is the destination that we'll end up with when we start to consider reality. What is real? And on the basis of what is real, how do I then build my decision-making processes? How do I then build my yoga practice so that I'm building on the foundation of what is real? If Satya is the foundation of our practice, then what our practice does is it constructs an unbelievably beautiful being, intellectually, emotionally, and indeed physically. And if our foundation's a little bit shaky, then all of the benefits that we get from doing yoga sadhana, they're potentially compromised to some degree, either largely or in a small way. And the benefits that we get turn towards creating karmas, which cause us to suffer. And so Satya is an important part of the foundation. At its simplest level, I think 236 in the sutras, Satya is identified as being that which is real or truthful. But let's dig a little bit in deeper into that. I'm going to turn to a notion that the human form is a combination of the real and the unreal. And if you can envisage Russian dolls, let's imagine that we have four Russian dolls, and at the center of the Russian dolls there is an empty space, and each of those dolls represents the koshas. I'm going to assume, by the way, a certain degree of literacy with the terms of yoga vidya and yoga abhyas. But the koshas they're like the elements, they're like sheaths, they're like those Russian dolls, with the exception that they interpermeate and interpenetrate each other. But we can envisage them as 5 Russian dolls. Now, the koshas themselves are our physical form, mental form, intellectual wisdom, anand, and so on and so forth. But the reality of our experience is normally so engrossed in the koshas that we don't have the opportunity to see ourselves as we really are. So I'm going to start this journey with the koshas. When a child is born, we have a short period where we are completely immersed in the reality of our existence. The reality of our being is completely our experience. In our tradition, we often say that a child is the closest form of divinity, that a child is divinity incarnate, because it hasn't yet gotten to that stage where it has now become disconnected with the experience of its own reality. So at that moment, when a child first opens its eyes, it is divinity experiencing existence for the very first time. Now, the analogy is that divinity is the emptiness at the center of the doll. And that divinity is the essence. It is the reality of what we are. Consciousness, pure awareness. But it has the faculty to give birth to something which is, let's say it's sun, for example, and that I would use the word attention. So consciousness gives birth to attention. And attention is the outward orientation of consciousness. So that center, that little gap at the center of these dolls, when it turns its attention outwards, it suddenly starts to experience each of the layers of the physical form. And as it comes outwards, it experiences the physical reactions of engaging with material existence, light coming through the eyes, movement being experienced, sound being experienced. All of those things start to then register and to create a memory bank, a data bank. But that moment of first experiencing something, purely sensory experience, going directly into the heart and the essence of who we are, that is our natural essential way of existing. That is the first experience of what Satya is, the reality of our own being. Now, this attention is actually at the heart of the whole human journey. In our tradition, we have this teaching about Ganesha sitting in front of his parents, Shiva and Parvati, and recognizing and understanding all of creation, whereas the other deities set off on a circumperambulation of the globe and the universe to discover what the source of all creation was. In the biblical tradition, we have this incredible analogy of the prodigal son. If you think of consciousness as the father, attention as the son ventures out into the world and becomes engaged and entranced until he is exhausted, and then his journey back to the father starts, and he returns. And attention is the prodigal son, consciousness is the father. And so in this sense, the journey is actually the journey inwards to that inner reality, because that inner reality is unchanging. That inner reality is present in every experience. That inner reality gives us the experience of joy, of delight, unbroken, eternally sustained. And that inner experience is the only aspect of us which is completely true. So in childhood, we have that experience. When we are fully engaged in something using the physical form in all of its dimensions, whether it's dance, whether it's entranced by an opera or a symphony, and we are fully experiencing just the anand of the center of our being and the pure experience that's coming through the form, with no mental interference, no clouds occluding the sun from the experience, we have a glimpse of that center and the reality of what it is. Now, imagine the sun, imagine attention being an energy protrusion. So it starts from the center and it protrudes out into the various sheaths. As it gets engaged in each particular sheath, it loses itself in that experience. And as these experiences continue, what then happens is memory of the Father disappears. Memory of its own source disappears. There is no attention connected backwards to its own source. And so if you think of it like as though it were an energy protrusion, when it becomes fully engaged in the physical form, there is no moment of turning backwards to the center. And that's what we seek to do in meditation. It's almost like the energy becomes circular, and all it's doing day in, day out is actually touching each of the senses, one after the moment, split second by split second, fully engrossed in physical experiences. A person who becomes depressed and becomes lost in an occluded, a polluted, almost a toxic manomaya kosh, becomes chronically depressed. And in the same way, attention is now circular and it's running around in thoughts, one thought after the next thought, one thought after the next thought, one unpleasant memory followed and connected to the next unpleasant fear. And so these circular journeys that the sun starts to take in each of the koshas is actually the unreal part of who we are. It's a distraction. It is a diversion. It's almost as though we've come to a roundabout on our journey and we can't get out of the roundabout. And yet it's not real because it's temporary and it's something which keeps us separate from the only reality, which is the reality at the center. Now this reality at the center, I'm going to try and give a description of the reality at the center and the sun in a number of ways. Now, the wise people of many traditions have tried to give a little bit of a pointer, a little bit of a definition as to what the sun is. The sun, so Raman Maharshi, he once said that the center is like the first person. Whenever we say I or whatever, that first person, the reality is actually the center of one's being. And the second person and the third person come out as a result of the first person existing. Raman Maharshi, he said, the second and third person do not appear except to the first person. So without the first person, there is no second or third person. Without the center, there is actually no attention. Without consciousness, pure awareness, there is no attention. And without attention, there is then no third person to be experienced. So the sequence is that the second and third person don't appear except to the first person. And without the first person, there is nothing. The first person is the reality. The subsequent ones are experiences of the first person. There's a favorite scripture of Swamiji's, which she captured really well, and I hope the translation is okay. She said, in the Katha Upanishad, she said, God made the senses turn outwards, therefore man looks outwards, not into himself. Now and again, a daring soul, desiring immortality, has looked back and found himself. Again, the center is actually the source, and attention is its creation, the false creation. In the Heart Sutra, there is a simple statement. It says, here, form is void. And it's describing that empty gap at the center of the Russian dolls. Huang Po, a Chinese philosopher, said, the ignorant reject what they see, not what they think. The wise reject what they think, not what they see. And so all of the experiences in Manomaya Kosh are our thoughts. And if we accept those as reality, we're accepting the waves on the ocean as being real without accepting that water exists and it's water that gives form to them. Again, the reality is what's at the center. Chuang Tzu said, what I call perfection is not seeing others, but oneself, a pointer to the reality at the center of our existence. Shen Hui, seeing into one's self-nature, is seeing into no-thingness. Seeing into no-thingness is true seeing and eternal seeing. Wu Men, let subject and object be so one that the wind cannot pass between them. Now this is an incredibly powerful and such an amazing pointer. Let me expand on this particular one. I'll repeat it first. Let subject and object be so one that the wind cannot pass between them. So, as I mentioned, the Father is the source, attention is the sun, and as the attention goes outwards, a gap appears between the two of them. But as attention turns and comes back inwards, that gap gets ever diminishes, ever smaller. Now, when we focus our attention outwards, whatever it is we're seeing or focusing on is the object of our attention. And we who are actually looking at that object, we are the actual subject who is experiencing that object. So the subject is what's behind my eyes inside. And right now I'm looking at a screen, and that is the object. But imagine if you can reunite attention with its source, when the object and the subject become the same thing. That's when the true essence is experienced. And in the Yoga Sutras, it says it so clearly. It says when the experiencer is reunited with its own essence, that's when yoga appears. That's the purpose of doing yoga sadhana, to reunite the attention with its essence, with its source. Because the source is the reality, the attention is a temporary movement of energy. Lu Tzu, he said, it is as if in the middle of one's being there is a non-being. The same pointer. And Jesus, he said, unless you turn around and become like little children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Again, reuniting attention with the source of attention. Now, because attention is variable, and attention can be attached to the senses of hearing, the sense of vision, any of the senses, attention moves from one to the other. But the source is eternal, it's consistent, it's ever present, and therefore it is real. The source is real. Satya is that essence. Lao Tzu, the sage all the time sees and hears no more than an infant sees and hears. So Manomaya Kosh is completely transparent So the sensation that's picked up by the physical sense is experienced at the center by the essence, with absolutely no interpretive, no calculative, no interference in between the two, pure experiencing. So the sage and the way in which the infant sees is the same. Manomaya Kosh is not running amok. It's not interpreting. It's not naming. It's not comparing. It's not measuring. It's just pure experience. Adi Shankaracharya, he said, having realized his real self as emptiness, the sage, without attachments and desires, clings to no thing. And then we get into the very dodgy statements, which were made amongst the company of wise people and therefore safe, but eventually left the confines of ashrams and entered the awareness of people who were not so wise and have been misinterpreted ever since. Rumi said, behead yourself. Tai Hui said, the precious Vajra sword is right here and its purpose is to cut off the head. Now you can see how amongst the company of not wise people, but passionate people determined to follow a charismatic leader, those misinterpretations could lead to some serious complications. Hafiz, how wonderful is the path of love where the headless one is exalted. Headlessness. This whole notion of headlessness is all referring to when the prodigal son gets stuck in Manomaya Kosh, when attention is actually totally engrossed in the processes which are running in Manomaya Kosh. And when you behead Manomaya Kosh, that's depriving it of its independent sense of existence, its independent storytelling faculty. It's not really to do with cutting of heads. Atta, he said, you must choose one of two things, either have your head cut off or go into exile. So again, this is not a recommendation, please don't try that at home. But the idea is that thoughts, all of those ideas point to the one function, which is to understand that thoughts are not real. That what we think, the moment we accept it as a reality, we are building a wall between the son and his journey home. There are phenomena which occlude and conceal the reality of our own existence. So without understanding the reality of who we are, everything that we consider real through interpretation, through analysis, is potentially going to create a difference and an obstacle on our way back into the source. So when Patanjali talks about Satya as a niyam, the yamas and the niyamas, all of them together try and focus on us and create a son who is capable of knowing the world, of engaging and entering into the world and returning back home to his father on a daily basis, on a moment-by-moment basis. Whenever it's necessary, attention can go straight back to the essence and the source, to look at everything that's going on in the physical space and in the mental space, and not be confused by accepting those as being real. This is something that is picked up in our tradition in so many ways. We see the picture of Shiv Shankar Bholenath with his eyes half closed. And the teaching is that attention is perched at that place where it's able to look outwards at the real world, the sun standing at the window looking out into the world, but also attention being equally distributed and focused inwards. So that little boundary upon which we perch ourselves, attention going outwards and inwards at the same time, is again a teaching that the reality and the essence must always be from that inner space. So how do we get back to that particular place, this reality of our own existence? I'm going to, in a few moments, put a set of ideas. What I'm going to do is to toss them into your Manomaya Kosh, okay? And so these ideas are going to hit your senses, you're going to see them, and they're going to, like pebbles in a pond, set ripples going outwards. And those ripples are of no great importance. Whether what I'm putting forward is true or not, it doesn't really matter. What matters, and I'm hoping, is the capacity for each of us to be able to see those ripples and understand the process of rippling and how it works. What I'm going to put in front is intended to trigger some ideas, and for some of us, I hope not many of us, for some of us, they will touch on what we dearly believe to be our identity. Now, these identities exist within us. Many times the identities are interwoven with our pranic sharira, they're interwoven with our emotions and our feelings. And so when something attacks an identity, some of our deeper parts are also made vulnerable. The experience is that they're made vulnerable. So I will pop that on in a moment. Prepare yourselves. I'm hoping we have some deeply religious people, because there's nothing like religion or politics to push the buttons of identities. But I did get your permission, and I did warn you in advance. So here we go. Let's jump in. So I'd like you to just read these words. Religion is fake yoga. Religion is a yoga. Now, this is a word I've created myself, Swamiji. I don't believe this word exists, but I think it should exist, and so I'm putting it out there into the global Manomaya Kosh. Religion is a yoga, fake yoga, created to prevent humanity from experiencing the simple truth that divinity is found at the center of our own being, no intermediary required. Now, this is a hand grenade, because there are quite a few trigger words in this. Now, I mentioned that at our earliest age, our earliest experience of ourselves and where we find ourselves, we opened our eyes, we had no words. We had absolutely no memory of names or forms. We had no memory of any interconnectedness within those things. And we accumulated and acquired name and form, and started to apply name and form, started to give importance to name and form, started to weave an identity with name and form. And this happened at a time when we didn't have a discriminative faculty. We didn't have a discernment, a faculty of discernment. Viveka, I think, is more discernment rather than discrimination, although once upon a time, discrimination meant viveka, the capacity to scrutinize something and identify difference and variances. But discernment, at a time when we didn't have discernment, we imbibed a whole bunch of ideas, and those ideas were woven into our forms so deeply, and we've never interrogated them. And more often than not, whenever our attention is drawn to them, we turn our attention away from them. And we seek to find comfort in many of these things which are not true. It's that instinctive desire that we have to reunite with our essence, and we try and fulfill that desire by reuniting and confirming with some of the threads, the fabric of identity that's woven with us, and we get stuck in identity. Now, this is really important at this time, because I don't think I've seen a time, or history doesn't record a time, where fake identities have been weaponized to such a degree as they have at this moment in time. We have been prevented from connecting with our deeper truths by identities. And there are forces and there are movements and there are people who are determined to prevent us from going past identity back to our original form. Now, this is the truth at the heart of our being. I think the best way in which I've come across this articulation is Adi Shankaracharya-ji, when he scripted Nirvan Shatkam. There is a beautiful, beautiful work which is sculpted with such an efficient use of language that it's minimalistic, and yet its repetition starts to undo all of the bindings of identity. One by one, it brings us back through the landscape of Manomaya Kosh to ourselves. But how do we move? How do we make that last step? We're approaching Q2, and what I'd like to do is to conclude at some point reasonably quickly, having upset all of your afternoons and having tossed a few identity political hand grenades in. And I'm going to withdraw and allow the dust to come flooding upwards, and hopefully we can see it settle again. But what I was going to just touch on is that this journey that the prodigal son makes, that our attention goes on to reconnect with source, so much has been written to make that journey, one, something that people are aware of, two, to help as a roadmap to getting to making progress on that journey. But the last few steps of that journey is actually a journey of only about 2 or 3 inches. And so I'm going to share with you how to make that last step. If you can make that last step of the journey and practice it, the rest of it falls away. And so this is really a wonderful, wonderful gift that I'm sharing with you. And my apologies for the death of all of the identities that are going to happen as a consequence, but it's worth the little step. So if you can practice, let's do it as a practice. If you can just sit comfortably where you are with your eyes open and look with your eyes with soft vision, not focused, not intense, not straining, just look at something across the room from you. And as you look, experience the fact that you're reaching out. Your consciousness has suddenly transformed into attention. And attention, the energy of attention, is reaching across the room until it comes into contact with the object that you're looking at, and the object then starts to become clear in your vision. Now, as you hold that object in your vision, as your eyes are looking at it, all I'd ask is that you ask yourself the question, where am I looking from? And if you imagine that the act that you've done, it's like looking down a tube, isn't it? Imagine a tube connecting your eyes to the object. So energy has reached along that tube and it's connected with it and you can see it. And when I say just ask yourself, where are you looking from? Your eyes are still focused on the object, but your attention slides back along that tube to your eyes, and then even inside of your eyes. It moves about 1.5 inches within the eyeballs themselves, into the center of the head. So the tube connects the center of the head with the object at the far distance. The last step of the journey is actually to just make that journey from any object, bring it back to the source of attention and keep it there. That's all that's required. The more time that the son spends with the father, the more time attention is resting in the source of attention, the more it begins to fill your awareness. Everything that's ever been written is intended to either clear the prickly thorns of identity and thinking and random beliefs, and all of those is intended to either clear all of those so that this one journey can be made, so that attention becomes reunited with its source and that it can stay there. That is the only reality, and in our tradition, that is what Satya is. Satya is the experience of yourself which is unblemished, untainted, unpolluted by any sensory perception, any external thought, any external name or form. This is the Satya that's referred to in the Yoga Sutras. If that worked for you with the tube, well and good. If it didn't, there's another little trick. Very simple. If mentally you say Om in silence and just ask yourself the question, where am I hearing the silent Om? Straight away attention leaps back to its source. So you will have experienced 2 things there. One is the silent Om at the center of your head. That's where it seems to be perceived. But the other thing is that when you look at something across the room and attention comes back into the center of your head, your vision softens. And rather than it being narrow and focused on one particular object, it broadens, and suddenly you start to see the world in a different manner. Please don't do this when you're driving, but when you're walking, try and walk with your attention on the source of attention, and just see how the experience of walking through a garden or walking between trees changes. Just see how you become not so focused on little objects, but suddenly the whole panoply, the whole panorama of what's in front of you starts to fill and expand into your attention. Those two little tricks, that's all you actually need to focus on. Swamiji, my apologies for having simplified it to such a degree, but in the limited amount of time, I thought that would be a nugget worth sharing. Another way that I found works really well is if you hold your finger and point it to yourself and just ask the question, as you look at the finger and it's pointing at you, right, where is the you that the finger is pointing at? And again, your attention leaps backwards into that center part of your being. And in that center part is where all the magic happens. That's the doorway. Everything else that happens afterwards is beyond our control. It is in the hands of an intelligence and a wisdom, a loving intelligence and a loving wisdom, which is greater than our capacity to manipulate, to coerce, or to leverage. And as and when it's the right time, it will then decide that the door is open. We have to get to the door, sit there, and be persistent, and be a bit of a pest, and make sure that we're knocking on the door regularly. And at the appropriate time, when it serves us and it serves everybody around us, that door then opens a tiny little bit, and then nothing is ever the same. So this has been my little contribution on Satya. This is the manner in which I was taught it and which I've practiced and understood the reality of it. And I hope that somewhere on your journeys, you too also experience the reality, the only reality of our being. And this is what Satya is for yogis. On that note, I would conclude with Om Tat Sat, and may it be so, in the words of Picard. Ramji, may I hand back to you? I don't know whether you had any questions, whether you want to take any questions, whether there is anybody else left. Let's have a look. But thank you all for listening.
There are plenty of people left, and so I would like to now open it up for questions. If anybody would like to ask a question, they can do so. And so Nirmala Iyer has a question. It's on chat line. Are you able to read the chat line, or shall I read it out to you? He said,
okay, here we go.
She says,
okay, Nirmala ji, namaskar. Thank you so much for joining. When the experiencer reunites with the source of experience. This is in the Yoga Sutra. It's the third, I think it's the third one, Swamiji. In the first pada, the third sutra is when the yogi rests in his own essence. So that's where I was referring to there. Now let's have a look. There was another place also. It's in the Heart Sutra, which is in the Buddhist tradition as well. So I scribbled these things down before the session started. I don't have to hand exactly where which shloka and which verse it was, but they're the two sources, the first pada of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras and the Heart Sutra. They both make the same statement.
Great. So Swamiji, you had a question?
Yes, Panditji. Thank you so much for that beautiful encapsulation of something so profound. But I wonder if I can just ask, and I'm finding it hard to articulate this. My guru used to say about karma, we can only decide what our karma is, not what somebody else's is. And in this search for identity, I am just wondering that we need to kind of perhaps make that caveat that it's my search, and what I cannot do is dismiss another's identity.
That is not only a deeply and valid caveat, it's also a safety caveat, which is why at the beginning of the talk I said, feel free to disbelieve anything that I say. And it's precisely for that reason. All of these teachings, their intention is to soften the bonds which exist in Manomaya Kosh. That is the purpose. The kosha, where all of our thoughts and our threads of ideas are woven together, where we store the data and where we process the data. That's the target of these phrases and these sentiments. Now, the karmas are those threads so dear to us, where we accept responsibility or we accept agency, that I have done this, I can do that. Where is that element exists, that becomes a karma for us. And there's nobody else who can actually go in and remove those karmas or soften those karmas. It has to be something that we receive and then we work upon, and then hopefully with a degree of safety we start to dissolve those karmas. So completely, Swamiji. The beautiful thing about our tradition is its very maturity in accepting that there are a billion diverse paths. Every single person is on their own path. Every single person is really on the journey of their own religion in conventional parlance. And so nobody can either take the steps for them or indeed judge on where they are on that journey. All we can do is reach out to each other and say, hey, this is what I've experienced. This is what I've understood. And in our tradition, we're blessed to have literally thousands and thousands of records of what individuals have experienced themselves on their journey, which they submit to us for our scrutiny and for our exploration. Beyond that, it is a personal, deeply personal understanding and experience.
Thank you, Panditji.
Until you come to a guru and say, help. And then the moment you stick your head above the parapet, it's not just your soul journey anymore. It is a dance. Like I said, it's a dance between ghosts. That was really the understanding between the statement about ghosts. Remember, the individual personality is a movement in Manomaya Kosh and Pranmaya Kosh. And ultimately, when both become tranquil, the ghost disappears. But until they become tranquil, the ghost is really guiding the ship. And that's the person with whom this dialogue is being conducted. So I put my hands up. I am being mischievous. I am talking to your ghosts, knowing full well that my purpose is to really disturb those ghosts, but do it in a gentle manner that none of you detect. Fair cop. Thank you, Swami.
Right. Other questions? You may raise your hand or put it up onto the chat line. Don't feel overwhelmed. I mean, just because he's good at the words that he says, remember that he had to learn English as well, like the rest of us. And so we can challenge him on some certain things.
Please feel free to.
Here's another question from Harriet. So it's a statement really that says that it's wonderful understanding the difference between religion and spirituality, having been raised a Christian and learning so many other paths.
Harriet, thank you for the courage in sharing this. We are in a time when religious identity for over 1400 years has been a mechanism for controlling and harnessing human beings. And it's not something that can be easily dealt with. The religious identity is deep. It's embedded both in our intellect and in our emotions. Both our head and our heart have been touched upon by the creation of a religious identity. And the degree of power that can be wielded by a person who can weave a religious identity into the mind of an unsuspecting, pure human being we see it on a daily basis. There are parts of the world in which religious identity is being wielded to perform acts which are so contrary to creation, and yet the people who are performing those acts have a complete conviction. They're totally 110% certain that what they're doing is correct. And that is because a religious identity has been so skillfully architected. And the reason I put this potentially troubling statement on that religion is fake yoga is precisely for that reason. It's to have a gentle poke and a prod at these religious identities. Adi Shankaracharya, in his wonderful poem that I referred to, he continuously discards. The poem is based on discarding that which is not real. And he continuously discards one by one the aspect of identifying with the body, the aspect of identifying with a tradition, the aspect of identifying with a nation or a civilization or a culture. Each and every one of those doesn't exist at the moment that we open our eyes on this planet. And so the journey is to get back to that pristine capacity to look at who we are and where we are. And so when you get to that stage, when mind becomes completely tranquil, there is no movement in thought. And so religious identity is totally suspended, as is all identity. And therefore, it is something that we say is not real. Yoga actually is the union of attention with the source of attention. It's the son being reunited with the father. That is what yoga actually means. That's the union that's referred to. And it's only after that happens that you then realize that the father is this thing called divinity. So thank you so much for that question about religion and spirituality. You know, our civilization has been conditioned not to scrutinize religions. But fortunately in India, we still have traditions, very vibrant traditions, which say, actually, everything is available for scrutiny by a human being. And not only is it available, it's beholden upon us to continuously prune any dominant ideologies and make sure that they're not harming humanity. So thank you for that courageous question. Very much so.
Now, Nikki Vesper has a question or two that she'd like.
She has two questions. She obviously has some Punjabis in her ancestry. You offer them one and they always want a second, don't they?
I have to say that Nikki Vesper, if I can just interject a little bit, Nikki Vesper supported us really right from the beginning when she came to the first festival. She happily offered her husband to us and said that Paul's an event organizer and he can really advise you on how to do these events well. And we went to see him and he was great encouragement, I have to say. So we're always grateful for Nikki for providing Paul to us and for both of them to support us all these years. So Nikki, your question.
I shall engage with Nikki with respect and courtesy, and she can have 3 questions if she wishes.
Oh, funny, I do have 3 questions. The first was comment that I have missed out that we should have been under a tent this weekend altogether. So it's nice to be here this Sunday. And looking forward to seeing you all next year with luck. My first one is just sort of a question about the experiment or the trick you called when you asked us to gently look at it as an object and see the object and then ask us what was the source of our seeing, and then said that we should sort of was in a tube back into the space behind the eyes. When you said to look back at where the source was, for me, I felt something in my heart center. So I was thinking, am I being misled by something in my identity or senses? And therefore, when I practice that experiment, should I look for the space in the area of the head?
That is a wonderful question. And I am now aware that in front of me, a person has asked a question, and the answer that I would give to that person asking that question would be an answer that would help that person. But the trouble is that we have a lot of other people who are also watching, and so the answer that I would give to people who hadn't asked that question would actually be different. So I'm going to negotiate this in a slightly... Okay, I will share with you the answer that will help you. And the answer that will help you is that it's wonderful that you had the sensation that you did. And what you need to do is to do it more, and it will reveal itself to you. Now, if I give you an explanation, the Manomaya course is going to leap onto that explanation because it will be so seduced by the attractiveness of the explanation, and I say that with all humility, that it will set off a whole cascade of thoughts and questions and everything else, which may prevent you from spending more time in the actual relocation of your attention with its source. So,
thank you. Yes, I understand that, and that's fine. That's a good answer and very helpful.
I will share one little bit of enticing, seductive understanding, and that is the word hridayam, which we refer to as the heart, is actually not located at the physical heart. It's slightly at a different place, and that is the center of our being. And yes, you certainly felt it in the correct place, but do it more.
And how do you spell that word, hridayam?
Yes, that's a very good pronunciation. Hridayam, H-R-I, Swamiji, D-A-Y-A-M, hridayam. That's
yeah.
Okay.
That's as close to it.
Nirmala coming to our rescue again. It's in the chat line now.
Oh, excellent! Thank you.
Lovely.
So that was the first. That was the first question, and I'm honor bound to offer you two more, but you don't have to take them if you don't wish to. You could bank one and keep it for the future.
Okay. The second one was when you were talking about the reality and saying that the true self, with capital S, being the I, and then you referred to a second or third person comes out of this. I was wondering who the third person was, or...
So as we're having this conversation, for you, I am the third person.
Oh, okay.
It's actually the English grammatical statement of personhood.
Okay. I was wondering whether there was something else. Am I not aware of a third person of myself? Okay.
No, that's exactly what it is. It's a reference to Einstein's proposal that everything needs an experiencer in order to exist.
And then if I may be really tricky, last one, because you're talking about religion, is fake yoga. Is Hinduism not a religion?
No.
Okay.
Okay, let me expand on that. Here is the interesting thing, in that, I mentioned these ghosts that exist within us, these false identities. So as a civilization, and indeed individuals, we create, or this ghost is created both by our own experience of who we are, but by other people telling us who and what we are.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the Occidental world, especially amongst the Indologists, they have created an identity which suits their framework, and in it, Hinduism is a religion because there are other religions, etc., etc. And more often than not, people who, like myself, engage in interfaith, we sit there quietly going, yes, yes, because there's no vocabulary yet to articulate that, in fact, we have no notion of this thing called interfaith being a valid construct, this idea of religions and so on being the ultimate understanding of human spirituality. And so, no, if anything, Hinduism is probably, Hindu is a geographical moniker. In the Vishnu Puran, there is a statement where it says, I bow to that Bharat who wears the Himalayas as a crown and whose feet bathe in the oceans as my motherland. So the nation was defined in that sense, and we call the civilization that has emerged in there in all of its color and diversity as the Hindu civilization. So it's a geographical and cultural, it's a civilizational moniker. Okay. It's a civilizational label.
Yeah.
And to reduce it to a religion doesn't serve us, and in fact it doesn't serve humanity anymore.
No. Yeah. Thank you.
And this conversation that you've just initiated and sparked off is a conversation which generates a huge amount of pleasure and great opportunities for mischief making at this moment in time.
Well, you go ahead and make mischief then.
You will see more of these little hand grenades being tossed about a little bit more in the months and years to come.
Good. Thank you.
Pat Leeson, thank you very much, Nikki. Pat Leeson,
thank you, Nikki. Wonderful questions.
Had a question for you. It's in the chat line. Basically, you mentioned about child opening the eyes, seeing the world from the point of divinity. At what point and how do the koshas and karmas cloud our view? And when does this happen, is her question.
Again, I'm so in awe of the quality of the question. That's a wonderful, wonderful question. Thank you so much, Pat. And firstly, your little caveat at the end that, apologies if this is an ignorant question. In my tradition, we have some very robust and direct exchanges. And it's a wonderfully British thing to be so self-effacing, but we need a slightly more robust engagement from our community now, okay? So please, no more apologies. We don't need apologies amongst ourselves. We need to be brutally honest and brusque and aggressive and assertive and rude. We need to exchange truths with a great deal of force and openness. So everyone, please, do not have any reservations about either thinking of yourselves as ignorant or indeed feeling that you may be judged. It's not something that happens in a Satya Sang, a satsang, a gathering of people on the search of truth. So thank you so much for your non-ignorant question. It's a wonderful question. So when a child opens their eyes, when each of us opens our eyes for the first time, in fact, even when we open our eyes as adults, when we awaken in the morning, the moment before your eyes open, there is almost a settling in to your body. When the eyes open, there is a moment of complete emptiness, and then into awareness, all of the memories start to flood in about who you are. This is my body. This is my bedroom. Oh, I've got to get the kids ready. There's a shopping list, etc., etc., etc. All of that stuff flows into awareness from our data banks. So the moment that the data banks are being referred to involuntarily is the moment when complete occlusion occurs. So if you think of this, in psychology they call it the personality project. So a child starts to form an understanding in its intellect of what it is by referring to what it has been told. Now in those of you who are from a Hindu tradition, certainly from the villages, I was born in a village, and we grew up with the teaching that never show a child a mirror for as long as you possibly can. And that's a great example for this question, because when a child sees itself in a mirror, it starts its identification with physical form. And so if you can delay identification with physical forms for as long as possible, the child is still thinking of itself as a point of awareness, engaging with the world, occasionally referring to sounds and forms that it's heard. Now, when does it cease, and what is the key point? When it starts to accept that the sound, which we call a name, refers to itself as a being. That name, that sound, its repetition, its utterance, suddenly starts to work its way into its awareness, and everything else is hung and suspended and attached to this name, which is why when religious conversion occurs, the first thing that's done is that name is discarded and a new name is given to which a new identity and a new personality can be attached and woven. So it's a garment. This idea that we are an identity is a garment which awareness begins to wear. Now, I mentioned that when we accept what's being projected into our awareness from our data bank without scrutinizing it, that's when the personality is in full flow. It's now an automatic, self-referential decision-making mechanism. It's almost like the sat-nav has now acquired enough data, and not only is it navigating from point A to point B, it's also making the decisions as to where you should go. So it is a rogue process running in our intellect that is underway, and that is the personality. It starts to happen when the child identifies with its name, It starts to happen when it's told it belongs to a family name. It starts to happen when it's told it belongs to a nation. It starts to evolve further when it's told it belongs to a religion or a tradition. All of those are the threads with which this automatic rogue identity is created. So 5, 6, 7 years, I think that's the age when the child starts to think of itself in accordance with what it's been told about itself. I hope that answers that particular question.
Yes, no, that was very good. I entirely agree with you. On your previous answer about is Hinduism a religion or not, don't we have to say that of the 1.2 billion people or whatever there is in India, at least half of them are contributing to this view that Hinduism is a religion? Isn't it prescribed by so many Indians that it's quite easy to see how it can be seen as a religion outside of India?
Indeed. And I think you're being generous by saying only half. I would suspect that the figure is much higher. But again, there is a reason behind this. And that is that I mentioned at the beginning that every word has behind it a mind web, a woven fabric of ideas which define or make us understand what that term is. Now, a religion from the Western mind web is totally different to dharma from the Eastern mind web. Yeah. And yet a connection has been made to say dharma as a darshan is actually a religion. I've heard many, many swamis who say, yes, all dharmas are the same. And you say, well, no, that doesn't make sense. In fact, because dharma is like mathematics or like gravity in that it's a universal phenomenon which is experience. And so to reduce it to an opinion or to a set of concepts or a set of beliefs diminishes the concept of what dharma is. And yet, so many religious teachers in India are teaching this. Sarva dharma sambhava is one of the most nonsensical statements I've ever come across in its conventional translation. Its true translation, it does hold valid. But you're right. It is Chinese whispers have created this cloud of confusion. And as more and more people do what I have done, which is stepped from my ancestral traditions and understanding equally comfortably into a language and a culture of a Western understanding, and what Swamiji and people like Swamiji have done, which is the opposite journey. So we have 2 feet, 1 foot firmly established in either and both cultures, that we can then start to bridge and hopefully start to erase some of these misunderstandings. And more people, we desperately need more and more people to be able to stand comfortably in both dimensions, both cultures, and start to be able to do the work of removing the misunderstandings and really digging down into the ultimate commonality. And that is that each and every one of us is an incredible being taking advantage of an incredible physical form. The earth has taken so long to be able to create physical forms which are capable of doing what we're doing. We have these amazing vehicles with which to understand who we are. And that is the ultimate understanding of our journey and our family relationship. Everything else that prevents us from doing that is a cause for suffering. So yes, we need more and more yoga practitioners digging into this space. We need to be able to talk to more and more people about this dimension of who they are and what they are. And sadly, a lot of it involves challenging the status quo and established power structures. And they know it. They know it. So it's desperately needed work. I must admit that here in the United Kingdom, I get a great deal of comfort and a great deal of encouragement that this work is being undertaken by our mothers and our sisters in this country. We need so many wise, white English women to be able to feel empowered enough to articulate their particular capacity for articulating this. They have a very, very special way of doing it. So yes, please drum up the interest, get more and more people on board with this. And this is the work that we have to do. There is no other work which is more important.
Right. No, I absolutely agree. And that's what we specialize in at the Yoga Festival. Intelligent women who come along and because they want to prod and find out these alternative pathways And
can I just say that I don't mean to be patronizing when I say that, by the way. I grew up with 4 sisters, so I'm a well-educated person. I was beaten into shape as a man on this planet with a very powerful mother and wonderful sisters. And there is a need at this time. As an example, in London, the premier nightclubs, they are using now women as bouncers, because there is a capacity for women to articulate and intervene and interfere using the garb and the presentation of a mother, a sister, a daughter. And that can penetrate into this completely misguided, almost toxic masculinity that is running amok. And when men try to do it with men, we can do it to some degree of success, but we do not have the abilities that women and our ladies have. And so we need to really give you guys a free rein to beat people of my clan up a little bit more. I said this once at a yoga conference in Ireland, and I said it quite innocently, not realizing that behind me all the Irish mums were looking at each other thinking, great, now we're going to sort these men out. So we desperately need more and more people to take this journey now.
I agree completely. Good. So any further reading that you can recommend?
Oh dear.
Well, if you think of it subsequently, when we circulate your video to all the people who registered, we'll certainly circulate your website. And if there's any articles and things that you wanted to attach along the way, we can do so at that time.
So I've just mulled over the question a little bit, and I would just remind everyone that this journey inwards is a journey which requires navigating Manomaya Kosh, this runaway thinking apparatus that doesn't want to stop. It thrives on creating questions and then answering questions. And our objective is to get the seeker to stop seeking. Right? Every time, if you think about what happens when you get an answer, if you've got a question which is really bugging you and somebody gives you the answer, suddenly it's almost as though the answer and the question hold hands, embrace each other and ride off into the sunset, and you never hear from either of them again. You never remember what the question was, and you're never remembering what the answer was. You know, it's done and dealt with. So the conclusion of the journey of the seeker is that the seeking stops. And anything that helps the seeker to stop seeking is of value. And there are 2 ways in which you do it. Either you read incessantly and answer all of the questions until eventually the seeker says, hey, I can't think of anything else, and puts down its weapons and says, right, I now give up. Or you recognize that this is where the destination is, and so you deliberately undermine the faculty of seeking at every opportunity. And that's the short, sharp, steep learning curve. The other is the gentle, longer learning curve. And there are consequences to making that choice. Now, when you do a mantra, you're undermining the seeker. You are imposing a relatively mundane, uninteresting task on the seeker. You're saying, just sit there and repeat this mantra. You're undermining the seeker. So anything that can be done to undermine the faculty of seeking is of value. But there is a caveat when it comes to reading incessantly, in that you make a really powerful seeker, and potentially a seeker who is so well armed with words and ideas that it takes somebody very, very skillful to defeat that seeker and get it to relinquish its own weapons. If there's anybody who's up for the short, sharp, steep learning curve, then I'm happy to undermine your seeker, but the consequences would have to be carried. Okay?
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed. If there's no other questions, then we would bring this to a close. Thank you so much, Satish Ji. It's been a wonderful afternoon. Really enjoyed it. And thank you for bringing to a virtual close in the presence of Swamiji. Thank you, Ambikananda Ji. Lovely to have you with us. So in that presence, bring a virtual close to a virtual yoga festival that we would have had this weekend. And we really look forward to inviting you all back, the teachers and attendees alike, because we're all teachers inside, to come and share this knowledge again next year. So thank you very much. My best regards to you, Satish. Thank you. It's been a wonderful afternoon, and we will circulate this video and all the details, and surely we shall see you next year again. Thank you.
Ramji, if I may conclude with a mantra, that would be, I think, a very valuable way of doing it.
Yes.
And Swamiji, if you have any concluding remarks or thoughts or guidance for any of the group, please take an opportunity to share that. If you have any thoughts, please feel free. And then if it's okay with Ramji, I will then close with a Sehna Vavatu mantra, which I think is just so pertinent and relevant to this particular group.
Yes.
Swamiji, you're muted. If somebody could unmute you.
I think we all have the power of self-unmute on this.
It's the power to mute, which is the issue.
I have nothing to say except thank you and my deepest gratitude for a very beautiful and enlightening teaching. Thank you so much, Panditji. Thank you.
Oh. So if you'd like to join me in the Sehna Vavatu mantra, anybody who knows it, please feel free and do share its meaning with any other members of our family who don't know it. Om Sehna Vavatu Sehno Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karvavahe Tejasvinavadhitam Astu Ma Vidvishavahe. Om Shanti 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 Om. Om Tat Sat.
That's lovely.